Hi, today we're going to examine oral traditions as historical sources. We'll be using the skills that we're developing as historians with written material and apply that to oral traditions. To do that, we're going to look at some primary source material from West Africa, specifically the Kingdom of Mali. So by way of a brief introduction, we'll look at some examples from world history. Um, this map here shows major trade routes around 1300 CE or BC. It shows the Eurasian continents were connected across vast distances, all the way from Beijing over to West Africa and up into Northern Europe. We have the Mediterranean area that's connected, the Silk Roads into Asia, the Indian Ocean and Indian Ocean trade networks, and also China's incorporated into this. But specifically, we're going to be looking at the Kingdom of West Africa and Ghana, which eventually becomes the Kingdom of Mali. So the Kingdom of Mali is recorded in the Epic of Sundiata, an epic of Old Mali, and that's what we're going to be using as our primary source material. It began as many smaller kingdoms in the area of the Niger River Delta. It becomes unified under Sundiata in 1235, and eventually later it will expand even more under the King Mansa Musa, and that's when Mali reaches its height. Okay, so a lot of times when we look at history, we think about studying the written word, and rightly so. That's the primary wheelhouse of most historians. But we also need to consider the use of oral history and oral traditions. And one thing that we've been looking at this semester are similarities across cultures. And it turns out that most of the cultures that we learn about and can study in world history do have a tradition of oral history. So for example, here there's three different examples pictured. One is a griot from West Africa, and that's the type of historian that recorded the Epic of Old Mali. And we have some Native American storytellers and European troubadours. So again, no matter where we look on the globe, there's going to be this tradition of oral history. So the question we kind of want to ask is, why is oral tradition important for world history? And then what can we how do we think about written traditions versus oral traditions and their place in our exploration of our past? So one of the questions we're going to answer is, why are oral traditions important? There's lots of things that oral traditions offer us if we include them into our arsenal of evidence in world history. The probably most obvious and biggest advantage is, in lots of places and lots of points in times during world history, the written word may not have existed. So if we can examine those oral traditions, and that allows us to look deeper into time than we could have if we only limit ourselves to the written word. The other thing about oral traditions that we need to consider is that changes in performance can tell us about changes within a culture. So for example, if you're looking at a West African community that has a deep, long-standing oral tradition, we can see changes, for example, in the performance of that tradition after Europeans come in contact with those people. So it's things like that that allow us to kind of situate certain events in this culture's past with events that we know are happening. So again, we know when Europeans got there, so we can kind of track those changes. The other thing is, again, it removes the limitation of only studying the written word, which kind of limits our view. So part of our assignment in this module is going to be for us to think about the advantages and disadvantages of using oral sources and written sources in world history. And one of the things that I hope you have front and center in your mind is this idea that traditionally, especially in the West and countries like the United States, the discipline of history has privileged the written work over other sources. Again, that's the primary source material that historians use. And oftentimes, if there's a conflict between a written source and an oral or a secondary source of that nature, historians tend to privilege the written word. So we need to think about what in our culture leads us to those conclusions. In other words, are there things that we can see in the development of our own culture that kind of expose this bias, if you will? But again, that's something we're going to think about. So in the meantime, I want us to kind of consider some advantages and disadvantages, and I'll give you some, but again, I want us to think about the others as a group. So with oral sources, one of the obvious problems is that they can degrade over time. Oral source continuing through generations requires the training of people in the stories, the performances, the ways that it gets passed along through generation after generation. Those things can decline, knowledge can decline, pieces can get lost. So that's obviously an issue. The other thing is, it's very easy to sort of rewrite an oral history, if you will. So for example, if a new king comes to power and wants to change the story of how he got to power, maybe he got there through less than scrupulous means, he can kind of rewrite the oral history for himself and kind of make himself look better. So that's something we always want to be on the lookout for. Now, considering that oral histories, especially in the context of the griot in West Africa, it's a highly specialized, highly trained professional class of individuals who pass this secret knowledge on to their descendants and kind of maintain it. They have code words built in and kind of their own built-in protections to try and stop the loss of information and protect it from forgeries, if you will. Now, with written sources, some of the problems we get is that it may lack context. In other words, if we have a one-page document that's part of a book or part of a story, we don't really have the context necessarily to understand that to its fullest capacity. Where with an oral source, we may get a performance or a play that we can kind of gain context for understanding the information within it. The other thing about written sources, of course, is anyone that is literate can literally write anything, right? There's a lack of specialization involved there. So if I have an axe to grind with a particular person in my community, I can write very terrible things about them, put pen to paper, and it's there for posterity. The other thing that's sort of an advantage of written sources then is if we have two competing accounts, we can compare those. And if we can build up enough context, we can kind of start making decisions about which one's probably more accurate, or even if they're both partly accurate. And of course, as mentioned before, with written sources, we get a limited source material to things that have actually been written down. Not only written down, but written down and not lost. So we only have the written sources that have not been destroyed or lost over time. So now it's time to put on your historian hat, and I'm going to have you do the Google worksheet based on the readings in Module 2. The goals of this assignment are for us to kind of develop knowledge of a culture from an oral tradition. So we're going to be looking for evidence of things we can learn specifically about the culture from Sundiata. And the other thing we're going to be aiming to do is organize our evidence for our discussion questions. So remember, we're going to be thinking about those global ideas from the mini lecture in Module 1, looking for evidence of ideas spreading, material, and contact between cultures. And finally, as we move forward, we should be finishing the Sundiata novel and continuing to look for evidence of connections between West Africa and the larger world. And we want to pay particular attention to the role of the griot. What is their role within the Kingdom of Mali? Are there benefits to having a griot? Are there potential problems with a griot? And we're going to use Sundiata as historical evidence. And always, if there's something you don't understand from this lecture, feel free to comment and we will discuss it.